Hey everyone, my name's Christy. Welcome to my corner. Thank you so much for joining me today for a pattern release extravaganza with fireworks and confetti and jazz hands. So this is a pattern that I'm really excited to release into the wild. It's currently in my Etsy shop, which I have linked down below. I've been sitting on this pattern for about a year. It was a Patreon exclusive pattern for last July, and I'm so excited to make it available to everyone. And the pattern is Bewitching Storm 1720. And so this is an image of a witch flying. This is a monochrome witch flying through a storm that is from a book that was published in 1720. I am apparently not the most creative in my naming of my patterns, but it gets the point across. And so what this video is going to be about is a discussion of the pattern itself as a pattern. And then I want to talk about the history of the image and the book that it's from, because I do think that this may be the start of a series of patterns based on those woodcuts from that book. But first, here is the actual stitched version here. This is stitched on 16 count Aida, and it would easily fit into a standard size frame. So let's talk about the pattern. As I said, it is a monochrome. And I stitched it in Salem, which is by Color and Cotton, which is a limited edition floss, but it's pretty close to DMC 930. It's sort of a dark grayish bluish, dark grayish bluish. And this is stitched on a one-of-a-kind, because I didn't think this through when I stitched it, but it's stitched on a one-of-a-kind hand-dyed fabric. But I was kind of looking around to see what would also be good for sort of modelly and purpley gray, and I came up with Be Stitch Me Mummy or Atomic Ranch Dunes. Both of those colors kind of are similar to this color, and I think that if you play off of those fabrics and colors, you'll get a very similar effect to what I have here, which is kind of a modelly, not black, bluey toned stitch. It is 100 stitches wide by 124 stitches high, but it is monochrome, and it has 3,791 total cross stitches. There's no back stitch, there are no half stitches. This is actually a really good beginner kind of stitch. And I do want to add that if you get a interesting sort of mottled fabric like this, you don't necessarily need these lines, these extra lines. So if you want to make it a shorter stitch, that is a possibility. Same with this cloud at the top. You don't have to put that in if you don't find it interesting. I think that the piece still works really well as a witch with a little town underneath her. Just to give you some sizes, on a 14 count fabric, it's 7.1 by 9-ish inches, which is about 18 by 22.5 centimeters. On a 16 count fabric, which is what this is, it's about 6.5 by 8 inches, which is 16 by 20 centimeters-ish. On an 18 count, it's 5.6 by 6.9 inches, which is 14-ish by 17.5 centimeters. And then on a 20 count, it's a kind of a really nice 5 by 6.5 inches, or about 13 by 16 centimeters. So it's not a huge project, and it would fit in a normal frame. Now I did it in monochrome because I kind of wanted it in monochrome, but it doesn't have to be in monochrome. There's no reason why you can't add colors to this and make it what you want. You could make these green fields and woods and brown roofs. You could make the sky gray or colorful or whatever you want. I just like a monochrome or like a limited color scheme pattern. And it's charted in black. It's charted in DMC 310, just the whole thing in one monochrome. I think that's all I really have to say about the pattern itself. It's not complicated, unlike some of my other patterns. It's very straightforward. So I want to talk about the history of this text. This witch comes from a book that I said published with, that, like I said, was published in 1720, called The History of Witches and Wizards, giving a true account of all their trials in England, Scotland, Sweden, France, and New England, with their confession and condemnation. So it's a very 18th century title. This version is in the Wellcome Library, which is a library in London, and I'll put a link to this text below. But the great thing about this text is that it has so many images. So the page I just showed you was the title page, and the facing page is this amazing image here, and I love it. And so I really want to take pieces of this book, pieces of these woodcuts, and use them as stitching motifs. I don't know that I want to recreate the entire images. I more want to kind of pull elements out of it that people can kind of put together how they want. This image, however, comes from a witch trial that is the first chapter of a woman named Julian Cox. Julian was a 70-year-old woman who was accused of being a witch in 1663 in Somersetshire, which is not how you pronounce it, but I don't know how you pronounce it, so I'm not going to. But she is she was indicted at Taunton in Somersetshire? Somersetshire? How do you say that? Anyway, she was accused of witchcraft and of practicing witchcraft. The initial accusation is practicing witchcraft against a young woman. But the evidence against her is very interesting because the accusations really tell us a lot about what people feared at the time. And that's really what witchcraft does. I have a whole series on witchcraft on my Patreon about the cultural implications of witch trials and witchcraft accusations, because they show what the community and the society are afraid of. And in Julian's case, they're afraid of women's sexuality. They're afraid of women interacting with other people in inappropriate ways. They're afraid of cattle dying, like they're afraid of agricultural failure, things like this. This is what they're afraid of. And so she's accused of a bunch of different things. So for example, at one point there were some hunters who were had their pack of dogs. They were hunting hares, I believe, and they came across her kind of bent over, acting like an animal, but like she was naked from the waist down, it looks like. And you can see that picture here, or at least her dress was up. It says, as soon as he laid hands on her, this is the hunter, as soon as he laid hands on her, it proved to be Julian Cox, who had her head groveling on the ground and her globs, as he expressed it, upward. He, knowing her, was affrighted that his hair on his head stood on end, and he spake to her, and asked her what brought her there. But she was too far out of breath that she could not make him any answer. So basically, she's in the woods doing weird things on the ground with her butt in the air, is essentially what's happening there. At another time, she met up with a friend or a man, not in a sexual way, but like met up with him outside of her house, invited him in. They smoked a couple pipes together. And as he was taking, Julian said to him, "Neighbor, look what a pretty thing there is." He looked down, and there was a monstrous great toad betwixt his legs. And so you can see here this picture of them smoking pipes with a big toad. And toads, of course, were seen as communing with witches. And this actually, toads as evil, has a long Christian iconography tradition, iconographic tradition. when I was in grad school, did a paper on Revelations and the artistic depictions of Revelations. It was an art history class. One of the ways that like lies and demons exiting people, or like to show someone's demonic or possessed and also to show that they're lying, is to have frogs or toads kind of leaping out of their mouths. And so it looks like basically like they're like eating these toads. So toads were kind of seen as evil. But the interesting thing is that this guy gets scared about this toad. And so he goes home and the toad shows up at his house. After he was taking a pipe of tobacco at home, and the same toad appeared betwixt his legs, he took the toad out to kill it, and to his thinking cut it in several pieces. But returning to his pipe, the toad still appeared. So it's like this toad keeps coming back, this demonic toad keeps bothering him. Nothing happens. Like the toad doesn't do anything, but the toad is always there. And so I find that very interesting. So in a third accusation, a neighbor was milking his cows, and Julian walked by and bent over and scored something on the ground, or wrote on the ground, it appears. And she was there for some time, and the cows went wild and started running around. They ran into trees, and several of them died. And so this idea of either making milk go sour, or stopping cows from producing milk, or killing cows and other livestock is a very common accusation against witches in these witchcraft trials. And so Julian is accused of bringing harm to her neighbor's livestock. Another accusation was that she could fly, not with the help of like a broom or a stick or whatever, but just fly on her own. And so there is an image here of her flying into her chamber. And fourthly, another witness swore that she had seen Julian Cox fly into her own chamber window in her full proportion, and that she very well knew her and was sure it was she. So another neighbor said, I know this woman. I've known her for a very long time. I watched her fly into her window. And so that's that picture there. See, so there are like lots of these great woodcuts. And now we come to the really kind of sinister part. And that's where this image comes in of the witch. So this is not a picture of Julian. This is not a carving of Julian. So let's talk about what this is. This comes from this image here. And Julian Cox is actually the woman who is standing. She is not one of the people flying. Julian is the one who's standing. During her examination, said that she had been out in the fields, and these three figures came flying at her. A witch and a wizard, both of whom had been condemned and executed several years prior. And so the witch in the storm that I have created or interpreted was the flying witch. It's not Julian. And then there was a demon, and the demon tempted her to give him her soul, or to that effect, and to express it by pricking her finger and giving her name in her blood in token of it, and told her that she had revenge against several persons that had wronged her, but could not bring her purpose to pass without his help. And that if she agreed to basically become a witch, he would help her revenge herself upon these people. And I mentioned at the beginning of this story that Julian is accused by a young woman, and this young woman is a maid in a household. And so now we get into that story where, like, why is this young woman accusing Julian of being a witch? Well, basically, Julian came to the house where this woman worked and asked for alms. And the maid said no. And Julian got upset and essentially threatened her that bad things would happen if she didn't do what she said. And she shut the door and went away. And so in the middle of the night, or later on in the day, the maid started having convulsions. So she started convulsing and cried that Julian Cox was in the house, and she basically asked the people around her to save her from Julian Cox. And everyone is like, what is she talking about? Julian is not in the room. So the night passes and the maid recovers in the morning. But then that evening, she realizes that Julian and this demon are going to come back. And so she takes a knife with her into her bed to defend herself against this, sorcery, essentially. Julian and the demon come back and bring a liquid and want this young maid to drink this liquid. And the woman says no. And so she lashes out with the knife and cuts Julian on the leg, this sort of fake Julian on the leg, astrally projected Julian. The people who were in this house with this maid went to Julian's house and she wouldn't let them in. And when she eventually did, they found a cut on her leg. So, this sort of shows them that Julian was astrally projected or whatever into her room and was injured in this, fight for this young maid's soul. This kind of torment goes on for several nights, and finally Julian and this demon come again to this maid and force her to eat pins out of the wall. And I don't know if these are like nails, but they're definitely like physical pins. So she's in pain, she's eating these pins. People are watching her, but they see her eating, but they don't see anything in her mouth. Only she can see these pins, and it just says pins. She is convulsing and in lots of pain. And so the witnesses around her undress her and try and help her, and they see these swellings that have pins in them, and so they remove the pins from her body. And the trial tells us, and upon the trial there were about 30 great pins produced in court, which I myself handled, all which was sworn by several witnesses that they were taken out of the maid's body in manner as is aforesaid. So these were the pins that were removed from her body. That's kind of the evidence brought into court against her. These different witnesses who are saying all these things, and that's the reason why this young woman accused her of being a witch in the first place. But the final nail or pin in the coffin for Julian was that the judge had heard that a witch could not repeat that petition in the Lord's Prayer and lead us not into temptation. In court, this judge, Judge Archer, asks her to repeat the Lord's Prayer. The prisoner was called for up to the next bar to the court and demanded if she could say the Lord's Prayer. She said she could and went over the prayer readily till she came to that petition. Then she said, "And lead us into temptation," or "and lead us not into no temptation," double negative, but could not say, "and lead us not into temptation," though she was directed to say it after one that repeated it to her distinctly. But she could not repeat it otherwise than is expressed already, though tried to do it near half a score times, which is almost 10 times, in open court, after all which the jury found her guilty, and judgment having been given within 3 or 4 days, she was executed without any confession of the fact. And so that's the story of Julian Cox. Julian Cox was a woman in 17th century England at the height of witch trials in England, and she did not survive her ordeal. She was executed. This, of course, leads to a whole conversation about who is accused and who is condemned and who survives these accusations, because by the 17th century, it's almost exclusively women. Now, this is a gradual thing that happens, and if you want to learn more about the history of witchcraft, you can check out my Patreon from last July if you're interested. But basically, by the 17th century, by the end of the 17th century, it is women who are accused. And mostly in Protestant countries, Catholic countries did not have the kind of witch trials that Protestant countries had. And so places like in modern day Germany, in England, in Scotland, because they were pretty more separate at the time. The Netherlands and the Americas, that's kind of where we get most of our witch trials in the early modern period. So this pattern has a history, and it fits into a history of witchcraft and witchcraft accusations. And I will have another part of a group of patterns that will be coming out in about 2 weeks from Stitchy Goodness zine, which is also witchcraft themed. I figured this would be a good time to talk about witchcraft and release my Bewitching Storm pattern. I'll post a link to the full text below. You can read the whole thing. It is in English. And I hope to have more patterns from these woodcuts in the coming months, because I do really think that they're interesting, and they give us an excellent look at the history of witchcraft, of ideas of magic and women and medicine and fear, right? And fear of the unknown. And that's kind of what witchcraft did for people, was it explained the unexplainable. I think that's it from me today. I want to thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the pattern, which you can find in my Etsy shop linked below. And I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about witchcraft and of this text, because it's a really, really interesting text. And I will see you in my next floss tube or my next video. And I hope you have a wonderful day. So please take good care of yourselves and have a good one. Bye.